Good afternoon, everybody. Great to see so many of you here, and I'm sure a few more will be joining in the way that we do these things on Zoom now, which is try and pack in as many things into the day as we possibly can. So welcome to this Evidence Library event. I'm Christopher Stacey. I'm Director of Support and Development at Clinks, and this event is the third of a new series that we've been running to give you the chance to ask your questions of leading academics talking about the latest research on important criminal justice topics. So I'm absolutely delighted that this afternoon we're joined by Dr. Gillian Buck. Jill will introduce herself in a second, but just to give her a short intro, she's a senior lecturer in social work at the University of Chester. She's a qualified social worker with over 10 years worth of frontline experience. Spent most of her career as a social worker in the youth offending service. She's published extensively and is one of the recognised experts on peer mentoring in the criminal justice system, which is what we're here to talk about today. And she also volunteers on the advisory board of a not-for-profit peer mentoring organisation. So in August of this year, we published an evidence review that Jill had written, looking at the evidence base around peer mentoring. And what Jill's going to do is take a few minutes to introduce that review. And I'll then pose a couple of questions for her to share her thoughts with everybody here. And then we'll open it up for you all to ask your questions of Jill. So in the meantime, as you're hearing the discussion, if you have questions, please pop them in the chat as they come to you. And Russell Webster, who's been working with Clinks in producing these briefings, he's going to lead the Q&A section in a little while. So if you have a question for Jill, please pop it in the chat and Russell will be collecting them in a little while. So that's enough about me for now. So Jill, if I can come to you, and I can see you there, hello. Everyone here today has had a copy of that briefing that you wrote. So could we maybe start by you talking about a few of the key takeaway points that you would draw out from that briefing, please?
Okay. Well, thank you for having me, Chris and Russell, and for everyone here for giving up part of your afternoon to engage with a conversation about evidence-informed peer mentoring. It's really nice to see so many of you. It is a question and answer, so you know, if you've got points that you want to make, questions you want to ask, please don't be shy. Always retreat a little bit at that word expert. I have a perspective on peer mentoring because I've researched it for a lot of years, but there's loads of you on this call looking at where you come from who will have different valuable perspectives on it. So please add your voices to the conversation. So just some headline summaries of the evidence review that I did for Clinks. Really, it was about describing what peer mentoring is and starting to talk about some of the potential benefits and potential problems that we might need to overcome. So peer mentoring essentially involves community members, often but not always with lived experience of criminal justice, working or volunteering in helping relationships in the criminal justice system. There is some evidence that this can be really helpful as an approach when people are trying to leave crime behind, or when they're trying to seek work with a criminal conviction, or that peer mentors can act as a bridge to other services that people might need or want to use. The bit that excites me, I guess, is it can also create a space where people come together to fight on collective interests and work towards broader social changes. So people with lived experience kind of enter a collective space where they can try to make improvements to the criminal justice system from within. I think there's a need for all of us, whether we're working in these settings, researching them, providing them, or around them, to remain vigilant for the potential for people to be re-traumatised through peer mentoring work. When people are cycling through prisons or criminal justice contexts, often they have experienced childhood trauma or personal trauma alongside that criminalisation, and going through, helping somebody through some of those experiences can bring all those personal experiences back for the person who's doing the helping. So I think organisations need to remain mindful of that, and I think I'll come back to it at some point as we're talking as well. There's also a potential that we need to remain vigilant of for people to be exploited as kind of replacement cheaper workers or free workers, particularly as austerity politics rolls back existing services. So I think it's important that these things are not seen, this approach is not seen as a cheaper alternative where people are less supported or less well developed as maybe professional workers have been in the past. So I guess that's the summary, Chris.
Super, thanks, Jill. And you did what what each of the three so far have done, which is do a very super but succinct introduction to help us get to the questions. So I have a few questions for you to start us off. So the first one is you begin the paper looking at the role of peer mentoring in helping people to leave crime behind and therefore reduce reoffending, partly because the evidence of its impact is often asked for in terms of does it reduce reoffending? And so I'm interested in what you would say the pros and cons are of framing peer mentoring through that kind of reducing reoffending lens.
Thank you. I guess one of the pros, or certainly something that we need to consider about this lens is, and the charity workers, non-profit workers in the room will recognise this, funders, commissioners often want to see results. They want to see that an approach works. And one of the common measures that are used, including by government commissioners, are reoffending rates. Is this an approach that reduces reoffending rates? So from a practical perspective, we can say that because these funders want results, it's useful for us to know whether we do reduce reoffending with our approaches. And rehabilitation or reducing reoffending work is big business. So to get commissioned is often a requirement for charities and organisations to provide these numbers. But I think by using them words, you're starting to see some of my hesitancy here because this is market logic that we can't always apply to people and change processes. That said, reoffending is a big social problem. It costs the UK around £18 billion annually, the impact of reoffending. And that's not to say the personal toll it takes on victims and people who are cycling through criminal justice systems. So reoffending is a harm that it makes sense to reduce from a personal and a cost perspective. So if we've got a tool like peer mentoring that might help with that fight, then surely we should pay attention to this potential. Some of the cons of framing it, I guess, in this way, for me personally, are that it could invisibilize, make less visible the broader potential of peer mentoring because it's much more than just reducing reoffending or an intervention to reduce reoffending. One person who spoke to my research strikingly said to me, you can't peer mentor your way out of poverty or racism. And this to me reminds us that we need to join together to fight bigger structural issues that are around, that lead to people coming into criminal justice systems. It's not just a case of an individualised intervention going in after the fact of somebody committing a crime. Often people can find peer mentoring helpful, but there's also like an upstream fight for us to look at about why are so many people coming into the criminal justice system to begin with. And often what peer mentors can offer is a unique perspective on that because they've been through this system. They know the reasons that led them here and they know the things that have helped them get out of these cycles. I've written a little bit about how peer mentoring motivates people to address these broader social inequalities. So one mentoring service, for example, became very interested in the massive overrepresentation of care leavers in prisons and wanted to use mentoring as a tool to help people who've been criminalised through state care, through growing up in care as a child. So in addition to their mainstream mentoring services, they also lobbied as a group for changes to the care system to try and break this pipeline. Another example is a young women's project who became very concerned about the young Black people they worked with being targeted by police when they were gathering together in groups. So they held conferences locally and nationally to challenge racialised interventions and promote positive leadership opportunities for people. So that's a bit of a long rant on your question about reoffending.
It's not a long rant at all, but I think it's really interesting that where you went there was you developed it to be more than just about providing a sort of commissioned service. So the examples you gave there was about the role of peer mentoring in supporting that advocacy work around systems change that maybe a commission service that focuses on reducing reoffending might not be as open to. So that's really useful, I think. So my next question is about how in the paper you say that often people see a peer mentoring as just for those people who are ready for change, but then you talk about how motivation to change often comes up when people feel confident that change is possible, and that there's some evidence that role models can influence this. And you talk about peer-led groups for those that are not consciously ready to change. And I was wondering if you could talk to us a bit about a couple of examples where you've seen peer-led groups being used in that kind of way to help motivate change.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll get to some examples of specific groups in a minute, but I think the first part of your question there was about motivation. And one of the things I heard repeatedly in peer mentoring settings was, there's no point us working with people if they're not ready to change. They've got to be at particular, they've got to want it themselves. And there is some criminological evidence to support that point of view, that people reach a stage where they're ready, where they find a hook to kind of change. But I wanted to think about this in the context of broader theory about how we learn and develop as humans, going back to theorists like Albert Bandura and René Girard. Bandura argued that we learn through modelling. So when we have a role model, we learn from those role models. When a behaviour is modelled to us, we learn from it. René Girard, who I've used in the book, argues that all learning, all human learning, involves the imitation of desires. So our identities don't emerge in isolation, but we see somebody else desire something and we mimic the desire. And this was kind of seen repeatedly in some of the data that was coming from peer mentoring. So these are not real names, but Georgie said, I wanted to feel the way they did. They weren't sad. They were that content in the life that they were offering to other people to help them. This is about the peer mentors, and I wanted to be able to do that. Lynn, who had been a mentee and is now a mentor, said that to meet people who were just as twisted as I was, that they've gone through that change. You see somebody for yourself go through them changes and be like a positive member of the community, and you know it's possible. So there's something here about people, the importance of people having people they can see who've gone through similar things as them, so that that can become the model for their learning. Lived experience leaders like Matthew Kidd, Rufus May have argued that it's harder to be the change if you can't see the change. And the same is true, I think, of workers. How can workers believe in change if they're never seeing people who've got through the other side? We can have this negative bias. So when we can see people who've made a change, it can spur us on, and we've got a model and a roadmap to work from as well. And I've seen this. You asked what examples of groups have been used to kind of spur people on in this way. I've seen mentoring organisations use boxing groups, arts and crafts groups, addiction recovery groups, youth leadership groups. Really, whatever the interests of the people they're working with are, they can build groups around that. So part of this is about listening to the interests of the people that you're working with. But the core theory behind what you're doing in that group, yes, it's about an enjoyable activity like a sport or an art, but the people running those groups are those models who you can see as an example in your life. I think the last thing I wanted to say about that, the importance of role modelling, whether it's in groups or one-to-one, is that peer pressure is spoken about a lot in terms of the reasons why people commit crimes, but it's less recognised as an influence in how people leave crime behind. And I think addiction services are often ahead of us on this. So Alcoholics Anonymous, for example, recognises that some group attendees might not be quite ready to fully embrace the programme when they come along, but it's easier to achieve when they've got a group of peers that they can look to.
Super, thanks, Jill. Moving on to something else that struck me when I reread the paper the other week. I paused at the section about peer mentoring, offering mentors themselves an opportunity to prove themselves. And it got me thinking about whether peer mentors are, generally speaking, voluntary roles or whether they're paid for roles. And it made me think about what can often be a criticism from people who have been through the justice system, who are maybe welcomed as volunteers, but then maybe not employed. And so I was interested as to whether there was any evidence about the differential benefits of peer mentoring services that are delivered using paid mentors as opposed to voluntary mentors.
Yeah, so there is a mix, and this is probably, people in the room will be able to update me on this mix about how much it's changed. When I was doing my research, predominantly from 2011 to around 2019, the majority were voluntary roles, but increasingly people were wanting a progression route. They were wanting to work their way into paid roles. Not everyone wants to work their way into a paid role. Everybody's experiences differ. So because this has been so volunteer heavy as an approach, if you like, I'm not aware of any evidence of differential benefits from paid or unpaid mentors. Others in the room may be, so you might want to share that evidence if you're aware of it. I think in my own work, there has been some evidence that mentees especially valued people who were volunteering. Lynn, for example, said the ones who are volunteering, you know that it's not just a job for them, they do actually genuinely care. And that was a message that was repeated. While most peer mentors are volunteers, there are examples of paid mentors. The majority of the paid mentors I've seen or met are employed part-time and receive low pay. So these are in the main volunteer or low paid roles. I think in terms of the prove yourself point, it's relevant to note that only 17% of ex-prisoners are employed a year after release. And in a survey of UK employers, only half would consider employing an ex-offender. So half would not consider employing an ex-offender. Now, in this context, this discriminatory context towards people with convictions, volunteering is one way that people can prove themselves to organisations, and many of the mentors that I spoke to progressed into paid roles within organisations. But I guess the over-reliance on voluntary roles can result in a form of mentoring that Helen Colley, she's a brilliant theorist on mentoring, warns of, which is expecting socially excluded people to mentor other socially excluded people without professional recognition, training or pay. And I'd add to that actually that often there are people higher up the chain that are profiting from that low paid, low supported role as well. I think this can be mitigated to a degree by organisations regularly evaluating the experiences of their volunteers and workers and planning clear development and progression routes for them where that's wanted. This is especially important in prison settings where choice about volunteer work can be really compromised. And we have heard some stories of people being allowed to provide a full voluntary service for an organisation within a prison, but when they try to get work or even voluntary work with that organisation when they leave prison, that isn't available to them. So I think if you're going to provide a service in this space as an organisation, it's really important to think carefully about development and progression routes for the people that you're working with.
I think that's kind of at the heart of the question really, as to how organisations think about that balance between, and particularly that the sort of progression routes for individuals that might come in. That's really interesting. And as Jill said, if others have reflections on that that you want to share in the chat, or any questions that you want to follow up with Jill on, please do. I'm looking at the clock, so what I'm going to do, Jill, is ask you one more question, and we'll open it up to the floor. And if we get a chance, I'll come back to the last one that I had for you. So many voluntary organisations have really embraced the importance of lived experience more generally throughout their organisation, including at leadership and board levels, trustee roles and what have you. But to some, lived experience can still be confined to the types of roles that we've been talking about as you described, kind of voluntary or low paid. So I'm interested in what evidence you think exists for how organizations that have peer mentoring schemes can use that as a catalyst to really boost the way that their organization enables peer mentors and others with lived experience to play other roles in organizations and to sort of develop in other ways.
Yeah, I guess I'm going to indulge myself in a self-citation here, because we've very recently published an article in the British Journal of Criminology, which for any Inspiral Carpets fans in the room does cite the Inspiral Carpets and use it as data analysis. So I'm very proud that I've got a 90s hit into the British Journal of Criminology. But on a serious note, what that article does is report what it feels like to share your lived experience in criminal justice roles. And it's really quite a devastating read when you hear some of the experiences that people have had sharing their lived experience in professional criminal justice spaces, and the way that we as non-criminalised workers have treated people in those contexts. And for example, one of the quotes from that study is from somebody who says, change is going to require us getting our voices heard at all parts of the system. Where is our voice in the big books? The big decisions are in government or in philanthropy or in grant funding streams. And those people have no idea. I mean, no idea. Why am I listening to this dominant narrative that I have got to change? I'm telling you, it's the system that's got to change, not me. I use that quote because you said at the beginning, is there some evidence we can point people to about the role that people can play and what research is telling us about how these systems could develop. So that paper, I think, could be really helpful for those of you who are looking to advocate on behalf of people with lived experiences, to try and ensure that they're not exploited or restricted in the roles and that they're not dehumanized in the services they're offering. Someone else in some of the mentoring literature said in a quote, how does an ex-offender get beyond where we are now and break that glass ceiling, influence policy and training? And the fear this person was voicing is that peer mentors may not move on to an equal footing, but remain deferring to policy and practice mandated by others. I did see one probation service where they became something of a flagship in successfully embedding peer-led practice. And this is reported on in the book, and I can see that people are asking for links to things. So anything I talk about, I'll make a little note to myself to put a link into the chat for you. And the British Journal is open access, so you don't need to pay to get access to that. Yeah, so there was this flagship probation organisation, and they did consciously create this development route where people started as volunteer mentors, but they could then progress if they wanted to into paid probation service officer roles. And this really, the manager who really stuck her neck on the line to start this work happening, because not many organisations at this time were doing this. She met a lot of opposition from people in the probation and police service about people with convictions having access to personal data and some of the risks that might be around that. But she said, no, this is important. It's important that our work becomes desistance in action and that we illustrate the positive potential of people with previous convictions. After the scheme had been running a couple of years, she said that those people had added value to the probation service and that there'd been a change in the office, and you could now see hope in the workers' eyes. That was the word she used. So I think to achieve this kind of organisational impact, you need strong individuals fighting for criminalised people, and you will meet barriers, and you're going to have to fight those barriers. But you also need training, support and planned progression routes for people once they're in post. And an example of this that I saw in a young women's organisation was they made links with what they called aspirational mentors outside of the organisation. It might have been a chief of police or a head of a housing organisation, a whole range of senior leaders in the organisation, in the community, who they linked their peer mentors with so that they could start to see lives, jobs, aspirations for themselves outside of the organisation as well. And I think lastly on this point, peer mentors themselves have pointed to the importance of collective allegiances. So lived experience peer support networks is something that organisations can really usefully introduce, so that people have someone to go and talk to when they are experiencing barriers or stigma or tokenism, because all of these things can still exist in the work.
Thank you, Jill. I was trying to find, and I will find, because you're busy, you'll be busy answering questions in a second, a link to that British Journal link, because I remember tweeting about it a few weeks ago, knowing that we had this event coming up. So I saw that question in the chat. I think at this point, we're going to open the floor up to questions. And I know we've already had one that I think links to a point that you were just talking about. So I'm going to hand over to Russell to take some questions, and he'll probably ask you to unmute. But Russell, can I hand over to you?
Lovely, thanks Chris, thanks Jill. I've got hundreds of questions on this subject as usual, but I'm going to zip my mouth and encourage everyone else to get their questions in. Christina, are you there? Christina Hall's got an interesting question for you, Jill, and I'm going to let her ask it herself.
Hi Jill. Yeah, I mean, everything you were saying sadly resonates, having worked in criminal justice 30 years. So my question is, and I'm sure Chris has probably heard me banging on about this previously, is the almost the insatiable need for people to make sure that if you are working with people with lived experience peers, that they have to be identified as such. And it for me, it's one of those things that actually, because of all the issues that you've really eloquently covered, is that the system or society may not allow them to move forward in their lives because they carry this label. I'm just interested in your study, because I think that it's your key messages around sort of about, especially around tokenism, which absolutely resonates with me, I've seen it over the years, is actually sometimes for me, is it necessary? You know, so, you know, as somebody who has experienced the criminal justice system, why do they necessarily have to hold that up? Can they just be supported differently with the reasons that you've said about somebody helping them to engage with some of the barriers maybe that are presented, without having to keep using the fact that they are a peer? You know, and I'm just interested really, because I've often just seen that people do have to just say I am a peer, and that never goes, because they're always a peer. And I've worked with people that were a peer 30 years ago, and people still point to the fact that we were a peer 30 years ago. So, you know, this thing about ex-offenders, when does it stop? Sorry, I'm a bit passionate.
No, it's a great question. Thank you, Christina. Loads of things came into my mind while you were chatting, and I don't think I have a set answer on this, but I have some things that came to my mind, so I'll just spill them. One, I think you shouldn't have to constantly disclose your previous convictions or life experiences. That's got to be completely your choice, and there's an ethical responsibility actually on organisations that invite people to use their lived experience to continually check in that that's something that people still want to do. Because I've heard time and again people, and they use words like they roll me out, you know, when they need an inspirational person, or very tokenistic practice, which becomes beneficial for the organisation at the cost of the individual. And that's not okay. That's something we have to make sure we don't do. Having said that, lived experience can be a really unique resource in terms of the inspirational role modelling part. It's just, the key is it's got to be your choice about whether you employ that or not, and you've got to be supported in that. And I think the mental health studies or MAD studies are often way ahead of criminal justice on this. And don't know if people have seen Costa's work. Again, I can find the reference for this on Hands Off Our Stories. Is this something people familiar with? So Costa and colleagues in the mental health context give out these cards to anyone who's thinking about employing the lived experience for some organisational or research benefit. And it asks them really careful questions to think about before they disclose their past. So things like, is it going to benefit you? How's the organisation going to use your story? And do you have any control over this? Will you be paid? reminding people that the internet lasts forever, and once your name and story is out there, when you apply for a job or a flat or a house in future, this might all be looked at. So I think your question led me to a place where the onus is on organisations to value lived experience, but also see it in the hands of the person who's sharing it, that's their choice, and that choice can change over time.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Jill. We've got loads of questions coming in, which is great. Kate, I'm going to come to you in a second, but Isabel Livingston, could you ask your question of Jill, please?
Hi, thanks, Russell, and thanks, Jill. It's been really interesting so far. I'm from Women's Centre Cornwall, and we have a peer mentoring project and have had for a few years, and we're just really at a point of reviewing it at the moment, and we're kind of grappling with the balance between two different aims of the project, and I'd just be really interested to know your thoughts around it. And one is that, so our volunteer mentors come from a range of different backgrounds, and some of them have experience of the criminal justice system, and some of them have other relevant lived experience, the vast majority of them do, but some of them, have like a former police officers, they're really kind of varied. So the aims of the project are to provide support to women who've been through the criminal justice system themselves and do that via volunteer mentors, and also to provide opportunities for women who've been through the system to volunteer themselves. And we find in lots of ways those two things are obviously really, really complementary, but we do find them a bit in tension in terms of how we actually sort of deliver and develop the project. And I'm also wondering, I've just recently started kind of managing the project, if sometimes the way that we try to organise it as a service for women is inadvertently putting barriers in place to some of the women with lived experience who might want to volunteer. I think our mentoring is one-to-one and is quite, we ask quite a lot of our volunteers. And I've been, just looking at recently trying to explore and find out whether we have more like volunteers with lived experience who find that more challenging for various reasons and therefore don't kind of continue as mentors, and which obviously means that the aim of providing volunteering opportunities, I mean, sometimes it's good that women move on. Obviously, if they're moving on to other things, they've got something from it, they're moving on. A lot of them go on and get jobs. Obviously, that's great for them, less good for us, but that's part of the nature of it. But I'm just interested to know your experience of any kind of like projects or any thoughts around this that successfully really balance both of those aims and how to kind of navigate that. And also thinking about, from the question that was just talked about earlier about, was really interesting, the idea of anonymous peer mentors, if you like, and how, I suppose that it made me think about our project, because in that some of our volunteers do, some don't. So the benefits of that, but on the other hand, are we then...
Isabel, can I get you to...
Sorry.
Got a few questions. Can I let you finish up and let Jill answer you?
Yeah. The needs of both peer and non-peer volunteers.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks. It's a great question. I think really that one possible answer might be to, and I always go back to this, work with the people using and delivering your service to see what their ideas are around this and what do they want and what do they feel able to provide. I work with a really great organisation in Liverpool who are very, very good at this, and they constantly adapt what they do, not to funder requirements, but because they are so in touch with the needs of the people using their service. It's a completely community designed service. So they recognise this problem that you're talking about, that not everyone wanted to be a one-to-one mentor. So what other things can we offer them to do? And lots of their service users are under 18 as well. So it might be that they were producing a piece of artwork, volunteering to produce a piece of artwork for the centre, or organising a memorial for a young person who'd been murdered in the community, or doing the piece of research around ADHD, which was quite prominent in the work that they were doing so that they could understand how to better support young people. So I guess it's being creative about other projects that people can volunteer on, not just one-to-one support, but being led in setting up those projects by people who are using your service and what is it they need, and the volunteers and what is it they can offer. I don't know if that answers you.
Well, thank you.
Thanks, Jill. Kate Ferguson's got an interesting question for us. Kate?
Hi, Jill.
Hi.
I think I heard you mention Alcoholics Anonymous before. Sorry, I'm from Alana House, based in the Women's Centre based in Reading. We've attempted a few sort of tokenistic small types of peer mentoring with sort of various successes, and I'm quite intrigued by the Alcoholics Anonymous model, which my limited knowledge of it is that they have sponsors, which are peer mentors, who frequently share their story. I think they take it in turns to do the sharing amongst people on quite a regular basis, but only when they've completed their 12 steps program. So only when they're ready to kind of take on being a sponsor and getting sponsees. And so it strikes me that could be something. I wonder if it's something that could be replicated in the ex-offender sort of organizations and services. Have you come across anything similar that might have been used that model before?
I mean, it is different, that model, to peer mentoring. It's more about, I guess the reason I was talking about peer support groups is they can be a great way in if people are not feeling ready to have a one-to-one mentor yet. And yes, I've seen peer mentoring organisations that adapt their approaches to include recovery groups, peer-led recovery groups, but not with as much structure as you've just described from Alcoholics Anonymous. So it's more about, because one of the things that some people have said about abstinence-based groups or groups that require set steps is that that's not for them at that time. They'd rather just have a more informal group, smaller informal group, where they could meet with people and discuss some of the challenges they're having. So the groups that I'm aware of that lead into peer mentoring have been much more informal like that, but set up and run by people with lived experience in those groups rather than by professional workers.
Thanks, Jill. We're sticking with the drug and alcohol theme here for a minute, Jill. I'm going to ask Alexandra Hamrati, to ask her question next.
I think you're on mute, Alex.
Unmute. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Sorry. This is absolutely fascinating, and thank you very much to Clinks for organising it, and to Dr. Jill for your guidance. It's so helpful, and I just want to sort of a question really to you in terms of your experience. We have secured some funding from the National Lottery to run a peer mentoring programme. And just to give you and work for the Nehemiah Project, if you don't know it, it runs a residential abstinence programme for men with addiction in South London. So we accommodate men, so it's very intensive support. The vast majority have been in prison. So we're now looking to kind of add extra support to those peer mentors, and eventually for those peer mentors to then become employees of the charity in terms of valuing its lived experience. So because we've secured some funding, there's so much good research out there, and there's so many organisations that already do this really well. Rather than create something from scratch, in the bid, the lottery, we have a pot that is enabling us to partner with another peer mentoring organisation within this space to run it and to advise us and guide us and to kind of design the program with us. So do you know of any other organizations, it could be nationally, it doesn't necessarily need to be in London, even though our houses are in London, that you can kind of recommend 2 or 3 that maybe we could approach? Or is there could you signpost me to somewhere where I could look at organizations that we can approach to do this?
Yeah, the first thing that comes to mind is Russell. Do you want to put the link to Peer Vols in the chat, which is...
oh, sorry, I can't hear you.
Oh, can other people hear me? Yeah.
Has everyone else? Sorry, for some reason.
Have you turned...
For some reason I can't hear.
Could somebody chat to Alex?
I'm so sorry.
Now turned the sound off.
So sorry. What were you saying?
Can you hear me now? Yeah.
Can, yeah.
Right, okay. Yeah, I've asked Russell to put a link to the Peer Vols resource, which is a resource that has been produced by a peer researcher collective looking at peer mentoring nationally, and some of the recommendations for people who are setting up to think about, for providers to think about. So that's a good starting point. I could give you 10, 20 excellent peer mentoring services. My hesitation about sharing names of organisations is that because I work for one, community-led initiatives that are amazing, they often get asked for, like, how do we set up, come and help us. And if they did that all the time without being commissioned to do that, they wouldn't be able to provide their own work. So I guess be careful in your ask of organisations of what it is, because unfortunately we're in a competitive space and we're all kind of bidding for the same resources. And
I know.
Balance that. I am aware, look for publications by these organisations. So there is stuff on CLI's website, community-led initiatives, if you want to look at that. And Phoenix Futures, who I think might be in the room, have done lots in your kind of setting, the residential abstinence setting. So that's something else, not my specialist area. So Phoenix have got some resources on that.
Thank you, that's really helpful. Thank you.
Thanks, Jill and Alex. Kate wants to come back with a second question, but because it's such a good question, I feel I've definitely got to give her the opportunity to do so.
Oh, brownie points, thank you. I just was curious to know if you had any attribute, or if you could summarise what attributes make for a good peer mentor, but equally any examples or attributes of unhelpful peer mentors.
Wow, what a question. Thanks for that, Russell. No pressure. It is a good question. It's not one I feel fully equipped to answer, I have to say. I'm going to draw on a study again. There's a paper called The Core Conditions of Peer Mentoring that I wrote a couple of years ago. And this draws on what mentees saw as making a good mentor. And there was 3 core conditions: listening, caring, and taking small steps. And they sound really basic and really common sense, to the point that I nearly never wrote the paper, because it's like, oh yeah, of course we should do these things. But it is one of the most cited papers because often we forget about going back to basics. Listening sounds like something we think we all do every day, but it wasn't until I left practice and did a research study and really listened to people that I realised I hadn't been listening at all in practice. I'd been listening with a purpose, usually an organisational or law-based purpose, and totally probably not hearing lots of what was being said to me. So when I say listening, I don't say it flippantly. It's somebody who is able and skilled enough to listen properly to people. Caring. We don't talk much about care and love in criminal justice, or certainly not in criminology, but these genuine human emotions and connection points are really important for peer mentoring. And often that makes it a really complex practice because boundaries become very complicated in peer mentoring. You can feel like you're very emotionally connected to the person you're working with because you might have had very similar experiences, and you might have very deep caring connections for them, and many mentors go over and above what's required of them. So for that reason, good supervision is really needed in peer mentoring spaces to make sure that people are contained and safe in their emotions, as well as being able to offer care. And then the last one, taking small steps. Chris mentioned at the beginning that I was a youth justice worker for many years. I think we expected massive things of young people in their supervision requirements, whether they were in prison or in the community. And I've seen lots of plans for adult prisoners and adult probationers, which are really massive in their expectations. And one of the things that peer mentors often quite naturally do is break things down into much smaller steps in partnership with the person. What's your first goal that you want to achieve? And it might be something as small as going shopping. But once that goal is achieved, there's a sense that I've achieved something and now I can move on to my next goal. And if I fall back and I make a mistake or a relapse, people are much more understanding of it because they've been there themselves, and they know that desisting from crime doesn't happen like that. It's often going to have fallbacks, so they're understanding of those slip-ups as well.
And if I can chip in as well, Jill, Kate, and from a slightly different perspective, because I've just done a piece of co-produced work in this area where we talk to a lot of people about their experience of training as peer mentors. And really large numbers of people said to us, well, I wanted to be a peer mentor and the organisation wanted me to be a peer mentor to share my lived experience. But there was nothing about that on the training course. It was all about boundaries and safeguardings, etc. And I wanted to know, should I share my lived experience? Should I always share it? How much should I share? When should I disclose? Do I have to disclose? And I think, that's the kind of same issue, but looking at it from a slightly different, through the other end of the lens, if you like.
Yeah, thanks for that, Russell. That's a good point. And it's reminded me actually that I'm a bit hesitant of saying bad peer mentor because, I don't know. I don't know if there are bad peer mentors or unsupported peer mentors. And I think that's often where the gaps or problems can emerge. Matching is really important in mentoring. So often one person who's a bad mentor to one person's a great mentor to another. So matching needs careful consideration and review. But I think we've seen examples of people getting burned out and getting put in positions they don't really want to be in, or being very triggered by experiences that they're working with and not having anyone to go to on that. So independent, regular supervision, again, is crucially important, but not just supervision like a tick box supervision, who you're working with, how are you, truly checking in on those containment of emotions, whether people still want to draw on lived experience, how they're drawing on that lived experience, and whether they need any additional support around that.
Well, my Zoom technique's not the best, and I've got 3 screens worth of people, but I can't see anyone with their hand out at the moment. But we have got time to squeeze in one last question if anyone's got a burning issue they'd like to. Kiera, you're up.
Hi, I thought I would just ask this question actually. So I'm a lived experience professional. I've got lived experience of care and the criminal justice system. I was in and out of prison through my teenagers, and we're just going to be setting up a peer mentor program now. Probably March, April next year is the aim to have our first peer mentor starting. So we've kind of arranged training, etc., etc. I'm also in 12-step recovery. I have been for 12 years, so I understand a bit about that side of it. And a lot of recovery happens in a coffee shop, actually, outside of meetings, where you're speaking to people that are at similar stages of you in recovery, and you're helping each other grow. And then you've got the older, wiser people that also give you, provide support. Have you done any research into someone who has lived experience, or know of any, setting up a peer mentor project?
Yeah, loads. I can put you in touch with loads of people. Probably, Kiera, if you want to direct message, email after today, I can link you in with some groups that you might find useful, because it's going to be important for you and your professional support network as you're developing this scheme, that you've got those people who've gone before you and can offer support. Community-led initiatives, where I'm a volunteer myself, was started and run by 2 people who've either spent large parts of their life in prison or in addiction recovery services. And I learned so much from being in that organisation about my previous social work. It's been like such a help to me to listen deeply to those experiences of people making changes. And it's something that my training and my professional work never gave me. So I think the question's important. Who can I link in with who are doing these similar kinds of things? Russell, does your resource name organisations? Does it?
Yes, we have kind of got links to some best practice. And Kiera, I'm sure you've heard of CLERO, the College of Lived Experience Recovery Organisations, but there's a number of new organisations, if you like, led by people with lived experience, trying to kind of spread the word, share their experiences, so that, as Jill says, it's not all mediated through a paid organisation that's got its own perspective.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you. I have met a few people that are doing similar things, of course, because I'm within the lived experience community. But that'd be brilliant. I'll send you an email. Thank you.
Lovely. Well, thanks ever so much, Jill. Thanks for taking on all questions. I think it's time just to pass back over to Chris now to finish us up, because our hour is done.
Thanks, Russell, and thank you to everyone that asked some really great questions, quite thought-provoking, I think, and so well done, Jill, for doing that. There's a couple of questions about sort of references and that. I think we'll be sending an email afterwards to everyone that's attended with another link to the paper and some of the links that have come through from the chat as well. So an hour flies by, doesn't it? So just to say a huge thank you again to you, Jill, for giving up your time. That was a fantastic set of questions and answers, really interesting. That's the last of the 3-part series that we ran at the back end of this year on the Evidence Live briefings. We're going to do a bit of work to look at how they've gone and planning some more similar events in the new year. So Helen, my colleague, has just posted in the chat a link to a feedback form, which I'd be hugely grateful if you can literally take a minute to click that link and share some thoughts of how you thought this event was. That kind of feedback is actually really hard to get virtually nowadays, because people just disappear. We wouldn't have let you out of the room in a physical event before you filled out a form. Now you can just press a red button and carry on your day. So please just take a minute to reflect on today. We'd be really grateful for that. And looking ahead, we've got a whole range of interesting events planned for the new year, so you can find out more about them on our website. Otherwise, thank you again, Jill. Lovely to see so many of you. Thank you all for joining, and hope you have a good rest of the day.